and we will start with our first ever webinar with regards to Indigenous people in Ontario. Hi, I'm Monica Turner. I'm the Director of Policy, and I and Leslie will take you through this webinar. We're hoping that what we go through will be less than an hour. We are planning to have questions at the end. I will tell you on your screen or on the system you're on, you'll see a button that says questions. Those questions will go straight to Leslie. If they're private questions or questions that you want asked at the end, and we'll do a Q&A that way. But just to say that we've got about 200 people registered for today. Some disclaimers and such. So we're AMO. We represent Ontario government, municipal governments in Ontario and the elected members. So you might be thinking, what are we doing a webinar on Indigenous people of Ontario? And the short answer is our members and municipal staff have been asking us for information, as this is an emerging field. People want to do things as well as possible, and we are doing what we can. We're not experts. We are learning, but it was basically a request from the municipal sector on we need to know more so that we can work well with our Indigenous neighbors. So we do have, AMO does have a great and active Indigenous Relations Task Force, which is how we do most of our work at AMO to develop policy and work through issues so that all types of municipalities and all sizes and geographic areas are represented. So we are working through a number of issues. This is the beginning of some work. We'll say with the new government, other priorities are also emerging, but you may see further work from us as we go forward. I will say we will post this deck, so you don't have to madly scribble or take screenshots. We will post this on our website. We actually have an Indigenous Relations page, so it will be there. And technology willing, this might actually be recorded so you can hear our voices. We also know there's a number of municipal staff conferences happening right now. So we are planning to do this again in November if there is a demand. So first to the disclaimer. And before we get started, so from an AMO perspective, we can only provide a province-wide framework. We have been asking the province, which is a crown government, to provide resources and tools for municipal governments and their staff in working with their Indigenous neighbors. We have been asking for this, and we've really asked for it when they were revising the provincial policy statement back in 2012. So far, there's been one treaty map that Leslie will go through, but we haven't received anything that's a municipal resource. So we basically just got on with it and did it ourselves, crafted what we could with limited resources to serve our members. So we have some knowledge, but as I said, we're not experts. So this is the huge disclaimer that this is not legal advice, this is basic advice. And because we're basically calling this a 101, it's just basic information. You may see later this year or early in the new year us coming out with a 201 presentation that's dealing with more complicated issues such as duty to consult and such, but we're doing lots of policy work. So disclaimer, we're a municipal organization representing municipal governments, but we're trying to fill a need that we know you have. Key takeaway we're looking for is basically talk to your Indigenous neighbors, talk to your communities within your municipalities and your neighbors beside, so you can work together. You need to build those relationships so that you can work through any difficult conversations that may occur in the future. We just know this, that when there's a problem, that's probably not the best time to try and have the basic introductory. We know that many, many municipalities, conservation authorities have already done this work. We're just trying to encourage everybody to do it. So what might you get from this webinar? Our objective today is just to give you an overview of Indigenous people in Ontario, traditional and treaty territories, and land claims. I'll be doing that section of it, and Leslie will be doing key Indigenous organizations, provincial, federal, and other resources, so we can direct you for, believe me, there's tons of material on basic and all the history books you can read, both as well as direct you to Indigenous oral traditions as well. And we want to end in tips for advancing municipal and Indigenous relations. As I said, hope there's time at the end for some questions. So just to start out, so as you all know, Indigenous communities and people are located in urban, rural, and remote Ontario, and there is a huge diversity, and I'll get into this. So don't assume if someone's Indigenous, one, they know so-and-so, but also that they come from the same cultural background. There is diversity, many nations, many communities, multiple languages, and various perspectives. There are 133 First Nations in Ontario, and this is, to use the legal term, on Indian bands under the Indian Act, which I'll get to. There's Métis communities. There's Inuit people living in Ontario, originally from communities outside of Ontario. We don't have, if you'll bear with me, an Indigenous Inuit community in Ontario, but there is a number of Inuit people in Ontario, particularly in Ottawa and Toronto. And there's also what is deemed, and you'll see the quotation marks, urban Indigenous people living in cities, towns, rural communities, which includes all forms of Indigenous people, including status, Métis, Inuit people, non-status Inuit, and just to say that non-status Indigenous people, because you've probably heard the term, are those that self-identify as Indigenous people but do not have Indian status under the Indian Act, which is a very formal process. And again, we're not going to go too deep, but there's various different Indigenous people. But I just wanted to say that when you see the word urban Indigenous, that doesn't mean they're living in downtown Toronto. That means that they're living off reserve, and that's the term they use, so we're using it as well. So what it means is it's off reserve, so it's generally in a municipality that they live if they're off reserve. I won't get into Crown land issues, and also just want to really highlight that urban Indigenous communities have been developing their own service delivery networks and representative organizations for decades. The Friendship Center movement, the Ontario Native Women's Association, etc. So moving on, I'm just going to get a little bit into the Indian Act, just again, so again, not to try in any way to talk about Indigenous history and from their perspective, but I think from municipalities' perspective, we need to understand some of the issues that lie behind the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the movement, the UN Declaration. There is, again, a good body of knowledge about the Indian Act, but things such as rules in the Indian Act around Indian status and First Nation membership, many individuals with direct ties to Indigenous communities or families may not be considered status Indians. To say that it is problematic legislation is putting it mildly. There's been lots of discussion about that, but you may not know that prior to 1985, Indigenous women, many Indigenous women lost their Indian status because they married a non-Indigenous or non-status men, but the opposite was not true. Status males could marry non-Indigenous women, and the women actually gained status. So again, fairly complex, caused quite a number of issues in so many ways. Also, Indigenous individuals who obtained a university degree, became a doctor, lawyer, or served in the army could lose status. This was called enfranchisement, and in fact, if you wanted to vote in the federal election, up until 1960, an Indian could vote in the federal election only if they had renounced their Indian status. Just to give you a couple of other times and dates, in 1884, the Indian Act mandated education for all Indian children to make sure that they could read and write English. In 1920, and many, many stories on residential schools, it was in legislation under the Indian Act that it was mandatory for parents to send their children to residential schools. As well, in 1927, First Nations council bands were forbidden to retain lawyers for the purpose of making claims against Canada. So you can see some of the ways that there was massive injustices against a group of people. There have been amendments to the Indian Act to rectify this to some degree, but you can also see very lightly on this topic, for what I've described, the harmful legacy. And again, that gets into, as I said, truth and reconciliation, the commission, the recommendations, and that may be some of the work we're tackling in the 201. So there's that history, the Indian Act, but you may also say, so what are the major groupings, cultural groupings in Ontario? And even under the Algonquin, and by the way, these, especially with Algonquin and Iroquoian, these are cultural terms, but they also denote different languages and different practices. Iroquoian peoples, generally hunters, fur trappers, depending on where they lived, they may have done summer gardens and such, whereas the Iroquoian very much horticulturalists, squash, corn, and beans and such. So there are very different lifestyles and different use of land. But the Algonquins, or that's the title of the language, but these are the Anishinaabe. And you can see the different differentiations. So Algonquins, Chippewa, Mississauga, Ojibwe, Potawatomi. There's also within the Algonquin grouping are the Cree in Northern Ontario, and the Oji Cree, which again are in Northern Ontario. And you can see Oji Cree is again a bit of a blend, lots of movement between peoples. And you also have the Munsee Delaware, which are in the London area. I've already noted the Inuit, but going to the Iroquoian, what you have at this point in Ontario are the Haudenosaunee, the Six Nations Confederacy. And this also gets into some of the complexity and the challenges because the Iroquois Confederacy is actually not recognized by the federal government. That's the hereditary political structure of the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquoian people. And the federal government only recognizes the Band Council. But you can see the Six Nations there, the Cayuga, Mohawk, which are the Eastern Guardians in the Akwesasne, Tandanega area, Oneida, which is around the London area, Onondaga, Seneca, which are the Western Guards, and the Tuscaroras are deemed to be the little brothers because originally it was the Five Nations and they became the Six Nations with the Tuscarora. There were the Huron-Wendat in Ontario, but they are now only found in Quebec. But this becomes very important when you're doing any archaeological work. If you're doing infrastructure work, you may, especially in GTA, in the Bruce area, the Huronia area, Penetanguishene area. There are many archaeological findings of the Huron, and in dealing with archaeological work, you need to work with the Huron Nation. The Gitane and the Neutral Confederacy are no longer present, but they were Iroquoian, and historically they're part of that in Ontario. And then you have the Métis, which are historically based in the fur trade, and where First Nation women and European traders intermarried and had a mixed ancestry, but again, a very distinctive culture. Just moving to the First Nation map. Again, this is the Government of Canada's, and there are many maps where, again, you can identify where the First Nations are. And again, this will be all posted for you, and Leslie will go through all the resources. Next, I'm going to go to Ontario by the numbers, because the Indigenous population is young, growing, and thriving. If you look at the average age of those self-identifying as Indigenous, you'll see it's 33.6, which if any of you are into demographics, you know that the Ontarian population, non-Indigenous, is actually older than that, and that the Indigenous population under 15 is the fastest growing population we have in Ontario. Giving you some numbers here about those self-identifying, and that's through Stats Can and such. But again, coming back to urban Indigenous populations, 85% of Indigenous people in Ontario live within municipalities. And I'll get to, it's my next slide. Just to say, okay, so where is the largest number of Indigenous people in municipalities? And we've put up the top 10 for you, and you may be surprised. You may have thought it was Thunder Bay, you may have thought it was Sioux Lookout, which is represented, you may have thought it was Kenora. 45 municipal governments in Ontario have a population that's over 15% Indigenous. Municipalities with the largest Indigenous populations are concentrated in Northern Ontario and Northeast and Northwest. However, Toronto and Ottawa have a very large Indigenous population. They just don't have the percentages that we can show here. And we also, in Ontario, have the largest First Nation in Canada, and that's Six Nations with over 10,000 residents there. So this is also not static, in the sense that there's lots of movement between First Nations and municipalities, primarily because they need to come to town for services, education, and health care. So there's, again, on your screen, the largest community there is Sioux Lookout, and you know that they are that community has a high concentration of healthcare facilities, hospitals, etc., because that's where all the residents from NAN come down, the fly-in communities come down and at least start their healthcare there. If the nursing stations at the First Nations are not adequate, they come to Sioux Lookout, and if they need to be moved to a regional center, they are. But that's why you have a concentration of healthcare in Sioux Lookout, but you also have it in Moosonee with 2 hospitals there, one at Moose Factory as well as one in the town and such. But just to give you an idea of the total populations, by the way, this is all available to you on Stats Can if you're looking for your own municipality. So I'm going to start moving into the discussion of traditional and treaty territories, because I think many of the issues that are raised with us from municipal staff in particular is, so what is the traditional territory? And I wish I could tell you that it was absolutely clear about how to work this through, but it's not. It's very much related to the history and the movement of the particular community. Indigenous rights are communal rights. They are not, you can be an individual, but and again, I'm talking in law and practice, your rights go where your communal rights are, where your family's history is, And as an example, and you know, please don't throw anything at your screens. Let me give you an example. A friend of mine is Indigenous, has treaty rights, lives in downtown Toronto, and as he always puts it, he's not going to be doing moose hunting in downtown Toronto. He, to exercise his rights, needs to go to his community to exercise that rights and such. At the same time, there is a difference between a traditional territory, which may or may not be in the actual treaty area they're in. So there is a lot of movement, and Indigenous ties to the land are very fluid, they're communal and spiritual. They don't own property or didn't own property in the way that the Euro-Canadians or the British did as they came over, and the French. They used the land, they didn't own the land, to talk about it that way. And that their defined territories are by kinship ties, occupation, seasonal travel routes. Again, an example from the area I come from Haliburton. The history shows that those from Rama would come up via the Trent and through the waterways, and their summer gardens and their fishing areas were up in the Haliburton area, actually in Algonquin Highlands area. So that's all there. It's just, it takes a lot of historical research and talking to the Indigenous peoples about what is their history, what is their territory. Again, it takes extensive work working with elders to actually map out traditional territories in the way that some would probably like it. If there was just a map of traditional territories, I wish it was that simple. It's not. As I said, they didn't own the land, but they moved about and through land. There, southern Ontario, there was a huge waves of people coming in and out. As an example, the Iroquoian people signed in 1701 a treaty with both the French and the English for the beaver hunting ground, of which there's again sketches of that. So there is different understandings and such, but each Indigenous community has its own history. I'll also say, so what we've done is we've tried to go back and give you some maps. Again, these are European type mapping of villages and tribal, their language, not mine, tribal distribution as of 1767. So one well before confederations, but this is just to show where there was an understanding of a particular nation. And you can see that. Continuing on, so traditional territories are specific to the Indigenous community and its history. And again, it depends on the circumstances. Each one is different. We also want to say, and some of you might be saying, but there were First Nation Indigenous people that came up during the American Revolution. That's absolutely true. There were a number of Indigenous allies that fought beside as allies with the British in 1812 war. This is where Tecumseh and Western Algonquin nations fought side by side. We also have other changes from traditional territories. Some of you in the Parry Sound area might be saying, so why do we have the Wata, the Mohawk community of Wata, up on the Canadian Shield if they're horticulturalists? Actually, they requested to the federal government to be moved from their area that they lived in Quebec near Oka, and they didn't make a request to be moved, and they got resettled. Another example is Moose Deer Point, again in the Parry Sound area, is actually Potawatomi, which if you looked at another map, we're close to the Detroit area. So there's been a lot of movement and changes where Indigenous people came as allies. Again, I'll mention Joseph Brant and the Six Nations. Again, they were allies, and the Haldeman Tract was deeded in thanks as allies. But that was then, and many, many histories have changed. People forget about some of this. So traditional territories, again, it depends on the history. There are a number of consultants that can do this history. I will also say the Indigenous members of the community can also walk you through their understanding. There's also the comment about, well, the traditional territory may be smaller than the treaty area, and I'll get to the treaty areas, but as per the treaties, unless there's an arrangement amongst the Indigenous people within that treaty, they can use that treaty. They are treaty people, as are all of us, but I'll get there as well. So there's another map, 1830, talking about Indian and white, again, their language, not mine, settlements around 1830. So again, you can see some movement, but you can see where some of the communities, at least at the time, again, pre-Confederation, were at least known to live, and that they're making distinctions between, Ojibwe, Mississauga, Algonquian, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Potawatomi, etc. You can see in this map, at least, some of southern Ontario is not indicated, and you've got some of the Six Nations below in what we now know as the United States, as well as the Ottawa and Miami. So a treaty territory, again, this is, at least from a Euro-Canadian or non-Indigenous perspective, as the way we have been taught, a treaty territory is actually generally mapped, and there's some cases where they're not mapped, but a treaty is a legally binding instrument in which Indigenous lands were ceded or surrendered their language to the Crown in return for specific rights, compensation. So in this arises because of the Royal Proclamation of 1763. King George of Britain, I'm probably George III, but don't quote me, sorry, I didn't check in on that. But basically there was a decree, and the British were running at least Upper Canada at the time, that Indian lands couldn't only be surrendered to the Crown, the British Crown at the time, through treaties. What they didn't want is people, as they did in the States and other places in the world, have third parties or private individuals go and buy land. They wanted it nation to nation, and that that the federal government, that the Indigenous people became fiduciary to the Crown, and that this would be, in their minds, to protect the Indigenous people. So surrenders of land could only occur through the treaty-making process. Treaties date from the purchase of land of the Niagara River from 1746, the year after the Royal Proclamation, to the present day negotiation of the claim, the Aboriginal title claim in the Ottawa Valley, the Algonquin. So it is can be defined as the geographic area under a treaty established between the signatory First Nations and the Crown. I will say there are some treaties in which it supposedly covers everyone, but there may have been a particular community that didn't sign, which can give rise to a claim. And different treaties, each treaty, and again, you can see the Robinson-Huron Treaty, the Robinson-Superior Treaties, Treaty 9, Treaty 5 with the with Nishnawsky Nation, Treaty 3, they all have slightly different language, and each time there's a treaty, they have it either has the same things or there's been some changes, but generally they provide for annuities without any inflation, land to be held in reserve, the the benefit of the First Nation, and harvesting rights. But even in harvesting rights, not all treaties contain that, and I'll come back to that. Pre-Confederation treaties were not well mapped or well understood, and as an example of that, I'll give you the Gunshot Treaty in southern Ontario around the Cobourg area, where supposedly it was the length of land from the shore of Lake Ontario to where you could hear the shot of a gunshot. And so you can understand why there were many misunderstandings about treaties. But again, there's the map of the treaties. And I will also say there are a number of treaties, primarily in southern Ontario, that overlap. So more about treaties. So the purpose was to provide legal certainty over the geographic area in question, while establishing the legal parameters for the relationship between the Crown, and I'll keep saying that. So pre-Confederation, it was the Crown was federal. After Confederation, you then have the division under the BNA Act between the federal Crown and the provincial Crown. What I'm trying to be as clear about is municipal governments are not Crown and such, but it's a relationship between the Crown and the signatory First Nations. Ontario is covered by 46 treaties and agreements, and certain groups have not entered into treaties, and negotiations are ongoing. Again, we'll show you a map of the Algonquin claim right now, and there are some areas in Ontario that are unceded, and the one that comes to my mind immediately is Wikwemikong on Manitoulin Island, and they say in any map you see it's unceded territory. So the first week of November is Treaty Recognition Week, and you've heard the term we're all treaty people because we all are represented by the parties who entered into treaties. And the history of treaties, again, there's the written, there's also the oral, and we again encourage you to talk to the First Nations, the Indigenous communities, to find out their understanding. In some cases, again, if you're a history buff, there's many writings, people's diaries and such about the intent, where they were doing their diaries, and this is both Indigenous as well as usually British, writing about what the intent was, which often goes into looking at land claims, which brings me to my last section. Sorry about going through all this history, but again, I hope you understand there is some clarity, but it's also fairly complex. So why are there land claims? Well, often it's a difference of interpretation between the Indigenous community or the Indigenous nation and the Crown. As you have gathered, the Crown hasn't always been the best fiduciary to Indigenous people, and so in many, many cases, what was in the treaty was not fulfilled. They didn't fulfill their obligation. One of the classic examples, and this is, I'll say, the Huron Superior Treaty, is the whole issue whether you used leagues, which was the French measure versus miles. And so there's been a number of claims on miles and leagues. The respect of Indigenous rights provided under a treaty, the protection, quite honestly, it wasn't until the Sparrows Supreme Court decision of 1991 that there was actually clarity about the priority of Indigenous harvesting rights after public safety and conservation. And for many, many years, especially in southern Ontario, the harvesting rights were frustrated by say the Ministry of Natural Resources, as they thought they were doing their job. So again, lots of things were in conflict and such. But the other reason for land claims is that they didn't reflect the intent of Indigenous signatories. And as I noted, there's actually been situations where not all Indigenous communities had their chief sign the actual treaty. So you've probably heard the different types of land claims that can occur in Ontario. And again, we're talking Ontario, obviously, but as you hear about things in the news, one thing to note in British Columbia, most of the, it's mostly Aboriginal title claims because there were no treaties. Again, whole other part of history. But where you're dealing with a comprehensive, and this is the federal government language, Aboriginal title is where the Indigenous community has never surrendered its land to the Crown. And the best example, again, is the Algonquins of Ontario in the Ottawa River watershed. The type of claim we normally have in Ontario is specific, and this is where there is a treaty and where there is something about the treaty that hasn't been fulfilled or it hasn't been honored. And one of the examples is flooding. Ontario Hydro and others did a lot of flooding of First Nation land, and there wasn't compensation or recognition of that. And I'm thinking especially again in, say, the Garden River area, Sault Ste. Marie area, etc. Lots of places where there was quote, again, legal term, injury to the community due to Crown action or inaction, and where the boundaries of a reserve were incorrect, or where they didn't receive proper quantity of land as specified in a treaty. And one land claim you may not be familiar with is what's called unsold surrendered lands, where the community wants the return of land that was surrendered for sale but never sold. So, sorry, from about the 1920s, it was the federal Indian office policy to sell Indian land that wasn't being used, and their definition of use, but they would put it up for sale. And there are pockets of unsold surrendered land throughout Ontario where it was put up for sale but never sold. The First Nation never received payment, or they want it back. But this gets down to even little bits of land on a highway, easement, etc. So I've talked about the Algonquin land claim. Here's a map of the settlement area, and for those in Eastern Ontario, you know that there's a memorandum of intent of agreement between Canada, Ontario, and the Algonquins of Ontario. There's still much to discuss. It's not a final agreement, and then implementation. So current claims, again, these are not all of the 48 claims, but there are 48 claims that have been accepted by negotiation in Ontario, and that means accepted by the Ontario government, some involving the feds, some not. 3 are being researched and assessed, and 11 settlement agreements are being implemented. So again, after there's an agreement, you then need to do the implementation, which again can take a very long time. To accept claims for negotiations takes a lot of work for the provincial crown or the federal crown. You have to do all the historical research, and from there you have to do a legal opinion, and that's all considered before they get into a land claim. So often you may have an assertion of a claim, but if the province or the feds have not accepted it as a claim, it's an assertion. Rather than a claim that's been validated and into negotiations. But this is all language you may be hearing, especially if you're in Southern Ontario. As a matter of policy, Ontario does not expropriate private land when settling a land claim, which is a major concern. They also generally don't frustrate an easement, and by that I mean especially in cottage country where people use easements to get into their properties. They do not deliberately set up a barrier where you have to cross a First Nation to get to your property. Again, it's all about how to work it through as good neighbors. There's lots of information on land claims, and there's a reference here of where to go for it. It's again the province. And we just gave you some examples of more complex land claims. I've talked about the Algonquins. the Williams Treaty First Nations, which again is central eastern Ontario. It actually overlaps the Algonquin claim. We just actually found yesterday that there was an announcement made on September 13th, so only, what, last week? Last week, yes, it's moving too quickly. But Canada, Ontario, and the 7 First Nations of the Williams Treaty have reached a negotiated settlement agreement for litigation that was underway. The federal government and the provincial government have agreed to pay $1.1 billion to the 7 First Nations, and that is made up of $666 million by Canada and $444 million by Ontario. So again, they probably worked out if it went to court, who would have the priority in paying. And each one of the First Nations gets up to can purchase up to 11,000 acres of land for each First Nation. That can then be considered in the federal additions to reserve policy. And I'll just say that their policy has changed. If you're familiar with it from 20 years ago, it had to be adjacent or be contiguous. Now it doesn't have to be. So again, it was the Williams Treaty that in 1923, at least on the face of the treaty, gave up their harvesting rights. These are now have been restored in this agreement and such. So thank you for bearing with all of the background. I'm now going to turn it to Leslie.
Hi everyone, my name is Leslie Munoz. I'm a policy advisor at AMO, and I'll be finishing the rest of the presentation with you folks today. So for this section, Key Indigenous Organizations, we essentially wanted to flag to you folks some of the key players in the field. You may want to know about them as you start building relationships, or you probably already do if you started some of that groundwork. And so this is very important. Also note that all the language was taken from their respective websites. We've also provided links to their respective websites, so we're going to be putting this slide up on the AMO website, and you can go ahead and access the links that way. So the first one I'll flag is Chiefs of Ontario. So Chiefs of Ontario represents the 133 First Nation communities located within the boundaries of the province of Ontario. For lack of a better descriptor, it's kind of like the AMO of the First Nations world. Municipalities are very, very different than First Nations, and Indigenous governments are a different order of government. But you know, that's a fair comparison. And another way to describe it would be the provincial version of the Assembly of First Nations. So they're doing a lot of great work, and they recently had a newly elected Ontario Regional Chief. So definitely encourage you folks to check out Chiefs of Ontario if you don't know more about them already. The other organization we're going to bring up is the Anishinaabe Nation. This is originally known as Union of Ontario Indians, so some of you folks may have heard that name before. And again, it's another political First Nation organization. 3 more First Nation political organizations that we want to flag to you. And I'll note that some of these are geographically based. So depending on what part of Ontario you find yourself, it might be more relevant to some of these organizations than others. So the Association of Iroquois and Allied Indians, Grand Council of Treaty 3, and the Anishinaabe Aski Nation, which is located in Grand Council Treaty 9 area. Sorry, yeah. In terms of Métis political organizations, the Métis Nation of Ontario is probably the largest one. An interesting thing about the Métis Nation is you know, they hold elections and community councils throughout the province, and they also function as a service provider. So they deliver a range of services to Métis folks living in various communities across Ontario. In the next slide, there's actually a map of where the community councils are located. So just by looking at that, you might know that there may be some in your near your municipality. I'll note that just because there's a community council office in these locations does not necessarily mean that the Métis folks who access that office have Métis rights in the area, but they are a good indicator of where folks are dispersed throughout the province. Other Métis organizations that are not connected to the Métis Nation of Ontario include the historic Saugeen Métis based in Southampton, the Red Sky Métis Independent Nation around Thunder Bay, the Woodlands Métis Tribe, and the Bar River Métis. Again, we've provided links, so feel free to go and find more information from them if you're interested. Moving on to social service providers, I'm going to actually, the Ontario Federation of Indigenous Friendship Centres, I'm going to quickly just flag that they were very, very helpful in helping us complete this webinar. They very kindly agreed to review it, so shout out to the Ontario Federation of Indigenous Friendship Centres for that help. There are 28 member friendship centers across Ontario, and they're essentially community hubs. They provide a range of services to urban Indigenous populations and folks living within municipalities. And they do a lot of great work. So if there's a friendship center in your area and you haven't made contact, I encourage you to do so. And here's a map of where the different friendship centers are located. Typically in areas that have a larger Indigenous population, so you may already be connected to some of them, depending on where you are. Moving on to other key Indigenous organizations, the Ontario Native Women's Association, the Ontario Coalition of Indigenous People, and the Tunga-Suvingat Inuit. Not sure if I pronounced that right, but it's an Inuit-specific organization that provides services to Inuit folks living in Ontario. So we also want to flag some resources that you folks should be aware of as you're beginning to do this work, and that's what this next section will be about. So provincial resources, the province of Ontario has prepared a number of documents and resources that we wanted to flag to you folks. So there's information on treaties, information on the province's response to reconciliation. There's also some materials on the duty to consult. We included them here, but just want to note that Ontario's approach to the duty to consult is very different than AMO's opinion on the matter. But they do have some resources there, and just to flag. The Ontario government has mentioned that municipalities, their assertion that municipalities have an independent duty to consult. AMO disagrees with that, and our 201 will be intended to cover more complex, more policy-oriented matters. So if you're interested in the duty to consult and the municipal role in that, we encourage you to check out that webinar when it comes out. But just to note that there are some differences of opinion between the Ontario government and AMO on the duty to consult. The resource there is nonetheless a useful one if you're interested in learning more about the duty to consult. There's also resources on land claims, and I'll flag the two next documents just because they're particularly interesting. So a few years back, the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing put out the Municipal Aboriginal Relationship Case Studies. So this document essentially highlights some positive examples of interlocal cooperation between municipalities and First Nations. So to see some good examples of partnerships and neighborly relations that have worked, I encourage you to check out that document. Also, the Urban Indigenous Action Plan. So this document was actually put together by the Ontario Federation of Indigenous Friendship Centers, ONWA, so the Ontario Native Women's Association, and the Métis Nation of Ontario, along with the Ministry of Indigenous Affairs, as it's known now. And it essentially provides useful advice on how to begin building relationships with service providers in your municipality, and ways that you can incorporate, find pathways to include more Indigenous perspectives in your day-to-day decision-making as municipal governments. This is also a new resource that the Government of Ontario came out with over the course of the summer. It's a new interactive map of treaties and reserves. I encourage everyone to check it out. We've provided the link and you'll be able to access it on the website. So the interesting function about this map is you can enter an address, a city, or a postal code, and it'll give you directly, what treaty area are you in, what are the First Nations associated to that treaty. So it's a very, very useful resource in terms of better understanding where you're located from an Indigenous perspective, and from taking into consideration Ontario's Indigenous history. In terms of federal resources, the federal government has a number of resources. We've put the general link to their webpage on reconciliation here in this PowerPoint for you folks to access, but I want to flag 2 other services. So the Aboriginal and Treaty Rights Information System, it's essentially the federal government's interactive maps of treaties, claims, and the interesting thing about it is that, again, it does use mapping technology, but depending on the options that you click, you can find out things such as, claims in the area, information concerning the communities in the treaty, as well as court cases and claims. So as a resource, it's very, very useful. I encourage you folks to check it out. And also, the interesting thing about ACTRES is through the federal government's consultation information services, you can actually get free webinar training. So if you follow the link there, it'll take you to the main page, and it shows when they're doing information sessions. So it's a good way to learn more about the ACTRES system and how to use it. And you may want to do that if you're interested. Other resources are the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Definitely encourage everyone to check that out. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action. Truth and Reconciliation Commission has a number of other resources as well, so very, very good resource. We want to flag that in terms of cultural competency training, the Ontario Federation of Indigenous Friendship Centers does provide some of that training. They do have a few workshops, and they have a ton of other resources as well. So, this is a good start, I think, for AMO providing this kind of information to our members. But there are a lot of organizations who are also doing this work. So we encourage you to check them out, especially because they come from an angle of expertise that AMO as an organization representing municipal governments just doesn't have. The other resource that I'll flag, just because I found it useful myself, is 21 Tips for Local Governments. It's an ebook offered free by the Indigenous Corporate Training Inc. So definitely encourage you to check out that resource. They also have Indigenous Corporate Training Inc. also has a number of other documents that are quite helpful. They're all accessible free, so you might want to check those out. So we wanted to finish the presentation by offering a few actionable suggestions that folks can take away. A lot of this presentation has been focused on information and trying to identify resources for folks. But these are some tips that you might want to pursue as you continue building neighborly relations with your First Nations neighbors and also with Indigenous people living within your community. So first off, get to know First Nation, Métis, and other Indigenous communities living near or within your municipality as part of continuous municipal practice. This includes their leaders and staff. And another important thing is to do the research of the history of your land. Often we have a very Eurocentric history, and it's important to see what other histories out there that perhaps we haven't learned about through our schools or through our textbooks, frankly. Develop good working relationships with your Indigenous communities, political organizations, and service providers. Make a friend before you need a friend is a way to simplify that point. Take your time, introduce yourself, and because of the emerging issues around duty to consult, send neighboring First Nations a notice of your municipal consultations. As well, a good practice may be to just reach out and ask what particular types of consultations would you like to know about and be notified about, just so that the First Nation, your First Nations neighbors aren't overwhelmed by tons of different notifications from different municipalities. So ask them what they want, what they care about and want to be notified about, and implement that in your day-to-day practices. Also identify pathways to reach out to Indigenous community members to obtain their perspectives and feedback on municipal initiatives, which is good practice generally. As well, often municipalities are neighboring communities with First Nations. So if you get to know one another, ask, what can you do together? What are some of the common interests that you share that working together might be easier to tackle than if you go about it on your own? Finally, the last point that we've put here is that it may be useful for you folks to find out what your Indigenous neighbors, what their interpretation of the Aboriginal and treaty rights are, as well as any land claims established or asserted that may impact your municipality. So just have a good sense of where your neighbors are at in terms of land claims in the area and other information that might be interesting for you to know. So that concludes the formal bit of the presentation. We've included our email addresses there in case you have any questions. Through the webinar, there's also a Q&A function. So feel free to click that box and we'll see if there's any questions from the audience and try to answer them to the best of our ability. So we can't transfer the audio over to you, but feel free to send us your questions and we'll do our best to answer them. And perhaps I'll wait a minute to see if any questions pop up. There aren't currently any.
And while Leslie is looking, again, we hope you found this useful. Again, just know that we're just trying to provide very basic information. We know that many of you are dealing with very complex issues in your communities. When we're talking about notification of consultation, we're talking about notification of the statutory consultations you need to do as municipal governments. We're trying not to, duty to consult is a whole other issue right now on such, but if you're doing an official plan, if you're doing what you're required to do by law in consulting with your public, that Indigenous communities are part of that public that live in your community or living adjacent to, and that's what we meant by notification. And if there aren't any questions, and I'm looking at Leslie again, we weren't sure, but we would appreciate, we didn't send out an evaluation sheet, but we would, I just saw there was a question. We are looking, again, we're just starting this work. Many of you are much more expert than us. If you've got some ideas, love to hear about them. At the same time, if there's individual issues at the local level, we can only provide very general comments about them.
So we do have a question. Can you supply a copy of the PowerPoint presentation? So this resource will be posted online on the AMO website. We've also recently created a standalone webpage on the AMO website called Municipal Indigenous Relations. So our intention is to put this PowerPoint, these slides up on there, as well as a recording of this presentation so that you can use it at your own discretion. And the good thing about that is that the links will be live, so you'll be able to access them more freely. So I hope that answers that question.
So again, we'll give it a couple of seconds, but we do thank you. We know that it's super, super busy. We know we're very close to a municipal election. We appreciate the time you've taken to be with us. We really would appreciate any constructive comments. I could joke, we'll take unconstructive too, but things that we can do to improve this. But we are working in just-in-time delivery and such. But this is an active area for AMO and our members. We hope you did find this useful. I'm just checking, is there another question?
So we do have another question. What if your Indigenous groups say they're not members of the public, that they're more than that, and how they participate puts us offside with provincial legislation? Monica, do you want to?
I'll start with that. The first premise is they are members of your public and you should approach them that way to start. At the same time, there is, and we didn't get into it, the Constitution, the enshrinement of Aboriginal and treaty rights in section 35(1) of the Constitution. If there is a claim or if something you are doing does impact or is perceived to impact on an Aboriginal or treaty right, yes, there is a different level of consultation. So when I talk about the statutory requirements for municipalities, where you're talking about the official plan and such, I am making the blanket assumption that that's not going to interfere or frustrate an Aboriginal or treaty right. If it does, that is where there is a higher order consultation. It is also an area where we are looking for the province and the federal government, probably to a lesser degree, the provincial government is more immediate, our comment is municipal governments are not the crown. I will not go into what's been happening in the last few weeks, but to use language in the newspapers, it's clear in some ways that municipalities are creatures of the province through the Municipal Act. We're not recognized in the Constitution. So one of the challenges we have is for that to be the reality, and then for the crown, the provincial crown, to then turn around and say that we have an independent duty to consult, which actually court cases have very clearly said it's a crown responsibility. So without jumping into what we're working on for the 201, it depends on the circumstances, and that's always our best advice, but there may be something you're doing, and let me give you an example. You may be doing something in your regional forest, if say your York region or something, that may indeed, because there's not much crown land in southern Ontario, that may frustrate a Aboriginal right to gather or a treaty right to gather something, or hunting or fishing. And again, the challenges of frustration of a right, of an Aboriginal or treaty right, at the same time, from a municipal perspective, if it's issues of hunting deer in a populated area, you've got conflicting issues. So the answer is start with how can we involve you in our basic work, but be aware that depending on who the First Nation either in or beside your community needs to be considered. But if you have Indigenous people who are saying that you're not recognizing us, that may just be an approach rather than an assertion of rights. So it always depends. And that's the best I can do without knowing the circumstances.
So we have two more questions. Do you know of any funding opportunities for internships or other for Indigenous hiring within a municipality? So admittedly, I think that you know, more inclusive hiring practices are very, very important. We have been, AMO has been advocating to the provincial government and the federal government for more funding to build municipal Indigenous relations, and frankly, initiatives like that are the type of things we are asking for funding for. I'm sure that you folks all know that that given the current political context, that our asks for more funding for this area perhaps aren't going to be answered for the next few years. But that is something that we're aware of, and it is something that AMO is actively advocating for, acknowledging that that it would be useful if there was funding available to build those relationships on the ground. So sorry for it's a disappointing answer to your question. Another question, is there a difference between a band chief and a hereditary chief?
And the answer again, and forgive me if there's anybody Iroquoian on the call. My example is yes, and that's what I was trying to gently get to when I was talking about Six Nations. When you're talking about the Haudenosaunee or the Iroquois Confederacy, that you're dealing with hereditary chiefs, you're dealing with a very long-standing governance system of the Six Nations. And Great Law of Peace, etc. And that is very different than what is has been imposed by the federal government under the Indian Act, and that's where you have the band council and the band chief. It's through the Indian Act you get that. So yes, you can absolutely have a difference between the two types of how to have a chief. Some communities, they are more merged than others. So that's the best I can do on that one.
So I think that the other thing to recall is the way that the Indian Act again did attempt to structure our First Nations was following, you know, something akin to a municipal model. And the band chief is essentially in that attempt to make First Nations and First Nations communities more like municipalities. That's where the idea of the band chief emerged, and the chief council, or the council. But again, that's a Canadian system that sometimes is imposed on communities. So sometimes the hereditary chief is a reflection of the fact that Indigenous systems of governance used to exist and continue to exist in some cases. Are there any other questions?
Again, I'm going to end it there, and you may not want to raise your question. Again, Leslie and I are not experts. We're just learning. And just know that this is an area where we are at least trying to provide information to our members, knowing that it may be incomplete. We're trying to give you references and resources and such, but stay tuned. We are looking to do more both policy work, which is the area that both Leslie and I come from, as well as more advocacy work. So stay tuned for the 201. And if you want to send us separate questions or such, we're always, we'll get to them as quickly as we can. But thank you very much for your time. It's appreciated. We hope it was worthwhile. Thanks.